The original Final Fantasy trilogy on the Famicom showcased a tight evolution of core ideas, with each new iteration morphing parts of what came before to fit a new vision. With the critical and financial success of Final Fantasy III, Square had firmly established the series as an important pillar of the RPG genre, and were able to set their sights higher than ever before for the upcoming fourth installment. However, this is where things get really interesting for Square, as they decided to take this opportunity to develop both Final Fantasy IV and V simultaneously. 4 was originally planned as one final game for the original Famicom, while 5 was developed with the new and exciting Super Famicom in mind. Things weren't quite working out for Final Fantasy IV though, and the game was ultimately cancelled. Series director Hironobu Sakaguchi originally claimed that the project was only in the initial concept stage, but he later admitted that it was actually around 80% complete. The original Final Fantasy IV will likely never see the light of day, as its existence has been mostly swept under the rug aside from the occasional interview question. The only marketing it ever really got was a mock-up screenshot in a Japanese magazine which described the return of FF3's job system with new additions like a priest, cook, and carpenter. This suggests that the original project was a completely separate entity from the game that we eventually got, and that's only backed up by Sakaguchi's comments regarding the original Famicom version. But that is really all we've ever known about it, and probably all we ever will know. Still, it's not like that original version was completely erased without a trace. Apparently, once it was scrapped, they took some of the ideas they had for it and moved them over to Final Fantasy V, soon to be appropriately retitled to Final Fantasy IV, the one that we all know today. Part of me feels kinda disingenuous opening up this video by describing Final Fantasy IV as a big leap forward, because every game up to this point has also been exactly that. One of the most central characteristics of Final Fantasy as a series is constant evolution, and that had already started well before the jump to the Super Famicom. And yet, I feel like I can't introduce it as anything else. Final Fantasy IV is just a huge step for the series in a way that 2 and 3 weren't. So much changed with this installment, and important decisions were made that would lay expectations and foundations that still affect the series even decades down the line. Before we get into why though, I want to go into some of the history behind the game, and more specifically all the different ways that it's been released over the years. So similarly to the original Final Fantasy, FF4 has notoriously been released countless times on numerous different platforms. Only this time there's a lot more to talk about with each of those releases. So, fair warning, this is going to take a while. If you'd rather skip straight to the discussion on the actual game, you can go to the timestamp on screen, and I'll put this in the description as well. I've taken a bit of time in each video up to this point to discuss the evolution of the technology and presentation from one installment to the next, but with Final Fantasy IV it's an especially interesting case because in addition to the extra experience that the team already had by this point, there's one more huge factor to take into consideration here: the hardware jump. FF4 is the first game in the series on the Super Famicom, and it does a really good job at putting that hardware to use. There's a lot going on here that just wasn't possible before. Sprites are more detailed and colorful, which is nice, and it makes the characters especially look a lot more distinct than they did before. There's now multiple background layers leading to some pretty cool looking parallax scrolling that gives off the perception of depth, and it really makes you feel the scale of certain areas more than ever before. Speaking of backgrounds, the backgrounds of battles actually take up the entire screen now, so gone is the black void of the Famicom trilogy. The core of the presentation is still the same as those first 3 games, but it's all been expanded so much. One of the biggest standout additions to me here is the utilization of Mode 7. Mode 7 is a new graphics mode to the Super Famicom that essentially lets sprites be scaled and rotated to give off a 3D effect. It's how you have games like F-Zero look the way that they do despite using entirely 2D assets. So how does this apply to FF4? Well, it comes into play with the airships of the game. In older titles, flying an airship looks like this. It basically just raises off the ground. It does the job well enough, especially when you take into consideration the faster movement, but look at the airships in FF4. The game utilizes Mode 7 to change the perspective of the entire overworld, and it looks awesome. It really makes you feel above it all in ways that the older titles never could. Still though, above all the visual changes, I think the biggest upgrade presentation-wise comes through the soundtrack. I've praised Uematsu's work in every game up to this point, but Final Fantasy IV is where I feel like the technology of the older systems finally caught up with his compositions. All of the music in this game sounds so much more full than it ever did before, and I think the biggest reason behind that is the significantly higher quality sound channels. They're still clearly digital, but they sound like actual distinguishable instruments now instead of just variations of computer noises. Just listen to the difference in quality between the prelude of the last game and the prelude in this one. But the better instruments aren't the only reason this prelude hits so much harder than before. Listen to this section. They actually took this chance to expand on the prelude, and this new melody that they added eventually became a series staple. It's a small thing in the scope of the whole game, but I feel like hearing this right at the start of a new playthrough further adds to the feeling that FF4 is a massive technological leap from everything that we had before. I also just feel like the songwriting here is Uematsu's best up to this point. I don't want to get too ahead of myself, but I feel like the music here suits the story of the game so well, and it honestly makes for some incredibly beautiful moments. There were multiple points during my playthrough of the game where I just wanted to stop, listen to the music, and take it all in. There's so many important beats here that are elevated so much because of the soundtrack. Here's one of my favorite examples. All in all, FF4 on the Super Famicom is a huge step up from the Famicom entries in terms of presentation. I feel like one of the best ways to demonstrate how far the series has come by this point is to compare the battle screen to that of the first game. Putting these examples side by side, it's hard to not admire how far Final Fantasy has come in just 4 games released over the span of 4 years, at least from a presentation standpoint. Unlike the 2 previous games, Final Fantasy IV was actually fortunate enough to get an English release in Western regions, and unlike the first game, it didn't take 3 years to get here this time. The Japanese Super Famicom version released in July of 1991, with the American Super Nintendo version releasing in November of the same year. So Western fans of the first Final Fantasy could quickly catch up with... Okay, I should probably get into this now. So I touched on this in the previous videos, but when these games were first releasing, Final Fantasy II and III were exclusive to Japan. They never released in Western territories until way later. Even the original Final Fantasy took 3 years to get here, so when we got the first game, Japan already had an entire trilogy. Final Fantasy II was actually planned to be localized originally, and there were even a few ads made for it, but it was ultimately cancelled because by that point, the Super Nintendo had already released. Square wanted to focus all the attention on the new console instead of continuing to support the outdated one. And so, Final Fantasy II and III were completely skipped, and Final Fantasy IV was retitled overseas to Final Fantasy II. This change made some sense initially, but over time it's only become more and more confusing. The game even still gets referenced incorrectly in pop culture.
Hey, check it out, I learned the bass line from Final Fantasy II.
Scott, you are the salt of the earth.
Oh, thanks.
And that's not even mentioning all the players that grew up playing and knowing the game as Final Fantasy II, only to have the rug pulled out from them years later and learn that they were missing 2 whole games the entire time. So the title change is messy, but unfortunately that's not the only thing that makes this version of the game less than ideal. Final Fantasy IV on the SNES is absurdly easy, even more so than its Super Famicom counterpart, and that's because it's been dumbed down a lot. The localization team basically assumed this was necessary because RPGs weren't nearly as popular in America yet, so they felt they needed to ease Western audiences in more. This also led to the development of Final Fantasy Mystic Quest, a spin-off game relentlessly made fun of for its overly simplistic mechanics. Turning this back to FF4 though, in addition to numbers being scaled down to make the game easier, a ton of different abilities were removed. I guess to make choices simpler as they didn't want the player to get too overwhelmed. For example, every other version of the game, Cecil, as a Dark Knight, has this Darkness ability. It's an attack that deals damage to all enemies on the screen at the cost of your own HP. It's a simple risk-reward mechanic, but fairly effective for these early game encounters, as well as adding some light decision-making. But it's just not there at all in the SNES localization. This means that the only action Cecil can perform for a decent amount of the game is attacking, and that's so boring. The same thing happened for tons of abilities throughout the game. It doesn't just make the game easier, it makes it actively worse, and it's honestly completely mindless at points. Final Fantasy IV is already a pretty good and accessible introductory RPG as it is in its original release. Removing so many abilities took things way too far. This game was also released in the era of highly questionable translations. This is not the most coherent script by any means. The Japanese language can express a lot more meaning in a lot less space than English because it uses characters instead of an alphabet, so all of the English text in the game had to be condensed a lot to fit on screen. Because of this, and because of the fact that text is inherently so important to an RPG, Final Fantasy IV on SNES is an extremely awkward game to read. Characters speak in very stilted ways and don't pack much emotion into their dialogue. Sometimes they just completely ignore proper grammar. It's definitely not the most graceful translation out there. You can generally understand what's going on just fine, but nuance and believability is almost non-existent. One of these mistranslated lines is so notoriously funny, it's become a running joke in the fandom, and it even got retained in later re-releases. You just can't get me to see Spoony Bard used as an insult and not laugh. Aside from that, the names of certain enemies are comically butchered. For one early game example, here's the Mist Dragon renamed to D-Mist. And on top of all of that, the terminology in this translation is all fucked up too. Instead of a potion, you heal with a Cure 1, and instead of using a blue fang in the intro of the game, Cecil uses a Lit Bolt. I think you get the point by now. This is very easily the worst way to play Final Fantasy IV. It's totally playable, yeah, but the localization misses the mark so hard in so many areas, it's honestly kind of astonishing. It's the way that I played the game for the first time, but I definitely don't recommend it. There is something to be said for experiencing a localization as botched as this one. It's something we definitely don't see anymore, so it does kind of have a niche kind of retro appeal. But unless that's what you're specifically looking for, I'd still stay away from this one. If you want to play the original version of the game in English, there are plenty of fan translations out there at this point that do the job much better. Hey, so just one quick interjection before I continue with the rest of this video. So I just mentioned fan translations and them essentially being much better than the official localization. So the fan translation that I used to record footage for this video was the J2E translation, just because it was the first one that popped up on Google. Through the section I played through, it seemed pretty much fine. But I'm having a friend play through it to record a little bit of footage later on because honestly, I just forgot that there was one clip that I would need and that I would need to go back through all of that. And so him helping me through that has been very helpful. So thank you, Aiden, whenever you watch this. But he's been telling me about a lot of the localization mistakes that version actually makes, and it kind of came to a head when he sent me this image referencing William Shatner, and I'm not sure how I didn't know about this before. Apparently this version is pretty infamous for that, so pop culture references just because the team was feeling silly or overuse of profanity or something like that. Anyways, basically, if you want a more authentic fan translation that actually does the job better, don't use the J2E translation. This is the 10th anniversary from like 2001, and it's very dated by this point. Apparently there's a new one called the Naming Way Edition that a lot of people like a lot more. So if you're wanting to play a fan translation of Final Fantasy IV, go for the Naming Way Edition. That's all I have, thanks. And honestly, we're at the point where I just flat out recommend the original release. The majority of the jank and tedium that made the original versions of those first few Final Fantasy games so unappealing has mostly been polished away by this point, and with just a little bit of patience, Final Fantasy IV on the Super Famicom is a totally accessible and enjoyable classic RPG. I totally get the appeal of future versions, but if you really want to see the extent of what this game looked like when it first released, and change the series as we know it, yeah, just play the original. That being said, there are still a ton of other versions of this game that I haven't even started to talk about yet, so let's talk about some of those. Many versions of this game are largely identical aside from a few minor visual differences, so I'm gonna group all of those together. The first group is primarily based off of the Japanese WonderSwan release, re-released in Western territories on the PS1 and GBA. I just recorded footage of the GBA version, but most of what I'm about to say is generally applicable to all of them. Anyways, if you played FF1 or 2 on any of these platforms, you basically know what to expect already. These releases were made very much in the same vein as those. So you have a few quality of life improvements, an updated script, a rebalanced game overall, etc. It's nothing crazy, but it is a decent step up from the Super Famicom original, with a few extra dungeons thrown in for good measure. With FF4 specifically, an ATB bar is added so that you can keep track of battles more accurately. I'll get more into what ATB is later in the proper game analysis, but for now just know that this bar on the battle screen was an addition to the re-releases. ATB itself is in the original release, it's just not visible like it is in the re-releases. There is one note that I have to make for the GBA version specifically though, and it's big enough for me to flat out not recommend this version to anyone. Final Fantasy IV Advance sounds disgusting. The GBA sound hardware is practically non-existent, so a lot of the games ported to the console took a big hit in audio quality, but this just might be the most intense downgrade I've ever heard. Listen to this. I genuinely found this version of the game to be so ear-grating with headphones that I stopped recording footage only around 20 minutes in, when for every other version I easily recorded over an hour. Can't recommend it at all because of this. It had its place when it was released, but at this point there's really no need to play it over literally any other version that won't torture your ears. And I'm actually going to go ahead and talk about one of those versions right now, Final Fantasy IV The Complete Collection on PSP. First off, why is it called that? Well, the PSP release is a little more than just another re-release. It actually included extra stories. One of these was Final Fantasy IV The After Years, a sequel to the base game originally released episodically on mobile phones. The other was Final Fantasy IV Interlude, a short side story set in between the original game and the After Years, made specifically for the PSP release. These are not talked about much, and are not something that I'm going to bother going into at all, because if we're being honest, the only reason the majority of players even consider this release is because of the main game. So how is the main game? Well, it's more or less the same as the GBA version from a gameplay perspective, but there has been a massive overhaul in presentation, which honestly looks pretty incredible. The game looks super crisp and clean on PSP, and in my opinion, it's the best looking version of the game that we have. The soundtrack is completely different too, and much more pleasant to listen to than the GBA version. Overall, really good version. For years it was the go-to modern re-release, and I still think it holds up really well. And that just leaves us with one more straight re-release, that being the Pixel Remaster. Just like every other game in the series up to this point, this is what I primarily recorded for the video since it's the most modern and accessible version, and it keeps the same improvements as all of those games. It's definitely the fastest version of the game, which I think ultimately aids its replayability a lot. It's another Pixel Remaster. If you played the rest of them, you know exactly what to expect by now. So that's all the main versions of Final Fantasy IV, but I have left out one big version of the game because I wanted to talk about it on its own terms separate from every other re-release. That version is the 3D remake released in 2007 on the DS, done by the same team that remade FF3 the year prior. You may remember from that video that I was not exactly impressed by that remake, so I didn't have super high expectations for this one, but I actually found myself very pleasantly surprised with what this version of the game has to offer. The most obvious distinction with the 3D remake is the presentation, which is mostly pretty similar to the FF3 remake. The game looks pretty dated by this point, it doesn't scale up to modern displays well at all, but I think considering its origins as a DS game, it looks just fine. The game sports a lot of new camera angles that help the whole thing feel a lot more cinematic than it ever did before, and I think they generally work pretty well. The HUD and text do look really ugly to me though, there's really no getting around that, they just suck. As far as the soundtrack goes, it's the same as the PSP version, but it was originally made for this version of the game, so I'll talk about it more in depth here. It's actually not bad at all for the most part, but it's definitely not my favorite either. It's inconsistent to me. A lot of the time it actually sounds really good, like with the new rendition of the Overworld theme. And other times it sounds terrible. So I'm kinda conflicted on the remake soundtrack, and because of that I find it easier to just say that I prefer the original Super Famicom songs or the amazingly redone Pixel Remaster soundtrack. Aside from that, the big new addition to the presentation this time is the voice acting. All things considered, the voice acting here is not bad at all. It's not gonna blow your mind or anything like that, but I feel like it definitely brings more good than bad. And more than anything, it makes the story more impactful. To show you what I mean, here's a brief comparison of one of the game's most iconic scenes.
In Mysidia, we stole a crystal from people who had done no wrong. worn this darkened armor for so long now. There's no mote of light left in me. Not even in my heart.
You're a good man, Cecil.
I'm a coward. A coward who cannot even defy orders he knows he ought not follow.
See how much more impactful it is? It's the combination of everything, the more detailed environment, the dramatic camera angles, the updated script, but especially the voice acting. There's gameplay to take into consideration too, and for the most part, yeah, this is Final Fantasy IV. There are a decent amount of differences, like there's some abilities that function differently, there's this new mechanic involving augments, and once again the game is harder than the original. But when it comes to story beats, map layouts, and the general overarching game design, it's the same FF4. The biggest downside to this remake, in my opinion, is just how slow everything is. It's even worse than the Super Famicom original in that area, if you ask me, and it just feels like it takes ages to get anything done in this version of the game. There's also a few other minor nitpicks I have, like the camera being way too zoomed in for my liking, but if you have patience and are willing to push through the higher level of difficulty, this is a pretty cool alternate take on Final Fantasy IV. Just like the majority of remakes, it's not something I would recommend in place of the original 2D version, but if you're looking for a fresh new way to play the game, yeah, go for it. Now that I finished talking about all the different versions of the game, I want to take a quick aside to discuss why this is where my feelings for playing the updated re-releases start to get pretty complicated. For the first 3 games, I totally get it. It can be really hard to go that far back in history. But say you're doing what I am for this retrospective series and playing only the most modern versions available. Well, a lot of the improvements FF4 made were retroactively applied to the first 3 games. The battle backgrounds, the Mode 7 airship effect, the general visual fidelity and sound quality, it's all the exact same as the original trilogy. The evolution of the game design is preserved, but not the whole experience. And on the other hand, jumping back to the originals after starting out the series by playing updated re-releases can easily cause whiplash. The Super Famicom version of FF4 is much less polished and snappy than the pixel remaster of FF3, and that can create some unfair dissonance should a player start to mix and match versions like that. I'm not saying you shouldn't play the updated versions of Final Fantasy IV or anything like that, because like I said, there are tons of benefits to doing so, especially now with the pixel remasters bringing all the 2D titles under one uniform banner. But it's that same uniform banner that can start to homogenize each of the games. All of them have the exact same title screen, menus, fonts, art style, etc., when these things were rapidly changing in the original releases. Even a lot of spells or abilities have their animations pulled straight from later games while completely ignoring their original look. It just starts to get really messy when you start looking at these games as a collective, and it's one of the things I was debating a lot when I was planning out how I wanted to cover the whole series. Like I said, I don't blame anyone for choosing to play updated re-releases over the originals. Even I find it really hard to force myself through the original versions of those first few games. I don't really think there is a right answer here. I mean, at the end of the day, just play whatever version appeals to you the most. But keep in mind that there may end up being some dissonance because of it, especially if you're playing through the series in release order. I know that most people probably won't end up caring about that sort of thing in the long run, but it's a topic that I see discussed so rarely, almost never at all, and I really feel like it deserves more attention than it gets. Okay, so with all of that talk about the countless releases of this game finally out of the way, let's dig into the game itself. Full disclosure here, this is a title that I have significantly more history with than any other game I've covered up to this point. Final Fantasy IV is a game I've been enjoying for years at this point. I first played it through the SNES version, revisited it when the Pixel Remaster came out, and continued to revisit it over and over through high school. This quickly became my go-to game to play on my school laptop during lunch periods when friends weren't around, or during class when I didn't have anything better to do. It's a game that I've seen through to the end more than any other in the series, and even though I can try to be objective, nothing can overwrite those memories of booting up BSNES during a free period and just wandering through this world. I love Final Fantasy IV. It's not perfect, of course, but this has become a comfort game for me in a way that few games ever do. Even compared to other games in this series that I love a lot more, few of them are as easy to slip into as this one. So let's talk about it. All 3 of the Famicom Final Fantasy games open up with this character menu where you see your party for the first time. Final Fantasy IV does not have one. Here's how it opens instead. Opening with a cutscene immediately sets the tone that FF4 is going to be a very story-focused game. However, this in and of itself isn't what makes the opening of this installment so effective. Pretty soon after this opening shot, we're introduced to our main character Cecil, captain of the Red Wings, looking pretty distraught over the orders he just had to carry out. Those orders were to steal the crystal of Mysidia and kill anyone who opposed them. Cecil returns to the Kingdom of Baron and expresses concern over the king's demands, but he's stripped of his command for doing so and given a new task to prove his loyalty. He sulks back to his room and expresses his feelings to his girlfriend Rosa before departing on his new task with the help of his best friend Kane. Here, the game calls back to the opening of the original Final Fantasy to mark the start of a new adventure. Even in just this brief 15-minute sequence, Final Fantasy IV has already elevated its storytelling far above and beyond what its predecessors were ever capable of. The first and third game purposely had more stripped-back characters, which worked fine for those games, but while the second game did have distinct characters, they were really flat and didn't offer any kind of substance or have believable relationships. Here though, the game devotes a good amount of time right off the bat to developing Cecil. With Final Fantasy II, the game would provide blanket descriptions for the characters but never expand on those at all. For example, Furion, the protagonist, is an orphan whose parents were just killed at the start of the game, and that was his backstory, but not once do we see how losing his parents affected him. There's no scene of him grieving, nothing like that. He has a sister, Maria, who's by his side the entire game, but there's never really any point where we see that relationship. With Cecil, not only do we see him being forced to follow orders he disagrees with, a relatively unique standpoint for a protagonist, but we immediately see how that affects him. He's conflicted on whether or not to stay loyal to his kingdom. He loves the king but is terrified of his own actions and even more scared of becoming used to them. And on top of that, he feels shameful for his own feelings, calling himself a coward. He confides in Rosa, showing vulnerability in a way he refused to with his own crew, signifying the importance of their relationship. Sure, by today's standards, this probably won't blow anyone away, but look at how impressive this is compared to the standard of the time. Look at the first 3 Final Fantasy games with their paper-thin plots, and then look at this one scene with more nuance than any of them. FF4 is a game that puts its characters at the center of the story. This opening sequence isn't about Mysidia or Baron or the Red Wings or any of that. It's about Cecil. The scene in Cecil's room is the perfect representation of everything this game is going for with its story. It's driven by characters and by emotions, and because of that, it's more compelling. The rest of the story follows in the footsteps of that opening sequence, which is to say it's completely focused on characters and their arcs above all else. There's multiple quiet moments where the plot doesn't really progress, but we find out more about the characters. For example, pretty soon after you first meet the sage Tella, there's a scene of the party resting at a save point in the middle of the dungeon, and the game takes a chance to dive further into his backstory and motivations here. So since the story is really all about the characters, how are they? Well, it's not just a static party of 4 or even 5 characters this time, there are actually 12 different playable characters. There's Cecil, obviously, as well as Kane, Rosa, and Tella, who I've already mentioned, but there's also Rydia, Edward, Yang, Cid, who's playable for the first time here, Edge, Fusoya, and Palom and Porom. Cecil, as the protagonist, naturally has the most time devoted to him. I've already described his starting point in the story pretty thoroughly, but where does he go from there? Well, after carrying out another order from the king that leads him to accidentally bombing an entire village, Cecil decides that he can't accept orders from him anymore. Cecil is replaced as commander of the Red Wings by Golbez, the main villain of the game. One thing leads to another, and in his quest to defeat Golbez, he ends up returning to Mysidia, the same place that he attacked in the game's intro sequence. He meets with the Elder of Mysidia, who feels that Cecil genuinely has changed, and so sends him to Mount Ordeals to leave his life as a Dark Knight behind and turn into a paladin. I think that this class change, in addition to being a fun callback to the first game, is an awesome permanent way to signify Cecil's character development, and it also feeds into the gameplay, which I'll touch on more later. This is more or less where Cecil's character arc ends though, only about a quarter of the way through the game. He's obviously still an important part of the plot, but Cecil internally mostly stays static from here until the credits. For what it's worth, his initial development is still really strong in my opinion, I just wish it wasn't over so quickly. As for everyone else, they all have their moments for sure, but none of them have anywhere near the same level of development that Cecil does. The characters in this game really shine through their distinct personalities and fun interactions. They all feel like completely unique entities that react to different situations in different ways, which is something that I never would have been able to say about any of the characters in any of the Famicom games. So the characters are generally pretty well done in my opinion, especially for a game this old, but as for the story itself, well, it starts out really strong, but to be honest, it kinda loses me by the end. When it's focused on Cecil and his transformation into a paladin, I'm totally invested, but past that point, it just gradually goes downhill for me. It gets really overly contrived with an obnoxious amount of mind control, and not much in terms of a satisfying narrative arc. It is always moving, so I'll give it that, but a lot of the time it can feel like a bunch of scattered developments happening unrelated to each other. But I guess that's what happens when you have 12 different playable party members and try to give all of them different moments in the spotlight. One of my biggest issues is that there are so many fake-out deaths throughout the whole game. At first you'll be thinking the game's kinda ruthless with how much it kills off characters, but slowly you'll realize that none of these have any kind of lasting impact. Anytime a character dies, it'll only be a few hours before they're revealed to be completely fine, and it all feels so cheap. And there's a couple of other specific beats that don't really work for me. The game reveals towards the end that Cecil and Golbez are actually brothers and descendants of the Lunarians, and I've never liked this. It doesn't add anything, it's not explored at all, it's just a twist for the sake of being a twist. It's totally unnecessary. It also pulls the same main villain was just a puppet for the real threat trope that FF3 set up. I didn't like it there, and I don't like it anymore here. In fact, I actually think I like it even less here, because they write it off as Golbez not being aware or in control of his actions through the vast majority of the game. And then they expect me to feel sympathetic for him in the ending? I know nothing about what Golbez is like aside from his actions when he was mind-controlled, so why should I care how he ends up? Why does Cecil care? Just because they're brothers that never knew anything about each other? I don't buy it. Still though, I'd be lying if I said that the story overall doesn't do anything for me, even though I don't really like the plot. And like I said, that is largely due to the characters. It's a weird, disjointed group with a constantly shifting dynamic, but it's a group that it's hard not to become fond of. The game moves pretty fast, so you jump from one subplot to another constantly, but going through so much with the characters gives you a really good chance to connect with them and ultimately care about them. And lots of the story seems specifically geared towards making you care about the characters. Edward's lament, Edge's face-off with his parents, Rosa's reunion with Cecil, Rydia's grand return, and of course, Cecil's transformation. It's moments like these that come to mind when I think of my favorite moments from FF4. It's why deaths in this game, even though they never last, still feel impactful in the moment, much more than they did in FF2. And it's why, by the end of it all, the send-off feels especially climactic and meaningful, more so than it had in any other game in the series up to this point. So, this is weird to say, but even though I don't care at all for the plot of Final Fantasy IV, the story as a whole, I think it works. Not only that, but it works a lot better than any of the original trilogy. It's definitely not without its problems, but this is a case where I feel like the core of it shines through, and it ultimately does a good job of keeping you invested because of that. I've continually emphasized the shift in focus to a character-driven adventure, but that's not only through the story. The game mechanics actually lean a lot into that as well. You may have already caught on by now, but each character actually corresponds to a different class, most of which are returning jobs from Final Fantasy III. You have Cecil as the Dark Knight turned Paladin, Kain as the Dragoon, Rosa as a White Mage who can also wield a bow, Rydia as a Summoner, Yang as a Monk. I could go on, but you get the idea. But what's really cool about this is the way that all of these play into the story. In some ways it's really simple, like Kain talks about his loyalty to the Dragoons, but in other ways it goes a lot deeper. I've already detailed Cecil's class change, which is a great moment already, but it's so much more impactful because of how it affects your playing experience. Cecil, as a Dark Knight, had the Darkness ability, a powerful multi-target attack that damages you for using it, playing into the idea that being a Dark Knight takes a toll on him. During the scene where he actually turns into a paladin, you as the player have to take the initiative to not attack. When he turns into a paladin, he no longer has the Darkness ability, and it's replaced with the ability to use white magic, which does the opposite by restoring health. He restarts at level 1, so there are some growing pains adjusting to the new skill set, but he eventually becomes much more powerful than he ever could have as a Dark Knight. It's pretty reminiscent of the class upgrade from the original game, only way more impactful and effective. This kind of storytelling is really cool, and it's seen all throughout the game. One of my other favorite examples comes through Rydia. As a summoner, she naturally has access to black magic, but at first she refuses to use fire because she was terrified of it after seeing her home burned down. It's not until she's taken time to get over it that she finally forces herself to use it to help the rest of the group. It's a big moment of personal growth for her, and from that point onward, Rydia can use fire in battles, letting the player feel that growth too. It's because of moments like these that Final Fantasy IV's story feels like it was written with the fact that it was going to be a Final Fantasy game in mind. And that may sound obvious in retrospect, but it was so fresh for the time. With the previous games, you could totally separate the story and gameplay without losing much, but that definitely can't be said for this game. Combine all the gameplay and narrative overlap with the heavy emphasis on characters and their emotions, and FF4 ends up being a pretty memorable game for all the right reasons. A lot of people at this point say that this game was the first in the series to really try and tell a story, but I don't think that's true at all. Final Fantasy II and III, primitive as they were, had very clear moments of direct storytelling, and II especially had a pretty involved plot. Granted, these aren't the most popular games in the series with today's fans, and like I mentioned earlier, those games did initially skip a Western release, so you could argue that has to do with how the evolution of storytelling in the series is perceived. But I don't really think that's the whole story here. I think that Final Fantasy IV was the first one in the series to put the story front and center. It's the first game to put a huge focus on its characters, and it's the first one to weave its storytelling through the gameplay mechanics. Because of this, it's the first story in the series that the player engages with directly. Or at least, that's what I would say if I were to ignore the heavy role-playing aspects of Final Fantasy I and III. Those were games where you were very much meant to insert your own cast of characters into the game, and like I said in my videos on those games, I feel like it worked pretty well. So what's the difference between what those games did to engage the player and what Final Fantasy IV does? That's actually a pretty simple answer. 1 and 3's player involvement was pretty passive all things considered. While the game certainly encouraged you to come up with your own set of characters and fun interactions, there's no way to force you to do that. The truth is, some players just don't have active imaginations. And to be clear, I'm not saying there's anything wrong with that, I'm just saying that those games don't exactly accommodate that kind of player. 4, on the other hand, instead of requiring you to project your own creations onto it, pulls you directly into its own creations. There's no getting around it, the story is the core of Final Fantasy IV. It's impossible to avoid and it will affect the way you play the game. I understand the intent behind what older games were trying to do with their more traditional role-playing style, and I don't think it's inherently better or worse than what 4 does, but the truth is that at the end of the day, this style is a lot more appealing to a lot more players. That is why Final Fantasy IV's story is so fondly remembered. And for the record, I'm not saying that FF4's story doesn't deserve the respect that it has. Remember, I'm in the camp that finds this style a lot more interesting than the previous games. I just think it's important to acknowledge that with the evolution of video games as a whole, very few things can simply be boiled down to better or worse. This is a very early example of a debate that will eventually become much more prominent in the series' future, and it's one that I rarely see discussed at all. Still though, surrounding the story is a whole new game with a whole new set of systems, so what's it like actually playing this game? Well, to start, I need to get into what is by far the most talked about change when it comes to this game, and that's the Active Time Battle System, ATB for short. The last 3 games all operated on a turn-based battle system where you had to input each character's commands at once and then watch the entire turn play out. So ATB makes 2 major changes to the way the battles go. The first is that commands are no longer sent out all at once, the command menu just shows up when it's character's turn and it goes away once the action has been selected. The second is that turns now operate on time. That's what the bar in the corner of the screen is for. It fills up over time, and when it's full, it's the character's turn to go. So what does this actually do? Well, if you ask me, it makes battles a lot more active and engaging. It doesn't have the same strategic, relaxed state as the older games, but in all honesty, Battles in those games rarely needed much strategy anyway. This just makes it more thrilling and will force you to make more split-second decisions, especially when a party member is at low health. I also really like that we have bars on the battle menu to track all of these. It makes the turn order feel a lot less random than it sometimes could in previous games. One of the things you'll have to consider in ATB battles is that there are actually 2 phases that a character goes through each turn. There's the waiting phase, which is before you select your command, and what I call the casting phase, which is after you've selected your command but before it actually goes out. This casting phase can take up a different amount of time depending on what it is you're using. More powerful abilities or spells typically take longer to cast, while simple actions such as attacks or items will practically skip the casting phase entirely. So, for example, even if one character attacks after another casts a spell, the attack may carry out before the spell. It adds an interesting layer of decision-making to frantic situations and overall makes battles more consistently involved and considered. Although, even powerful healing spells typically come out very quickly, which is appreciated. So that's probably the most noteworthy change that people talk about, but just as important in my opinion is the difference in how characters are handled. I touched on this earlier, but FF4's characters are all tied to a specific role. And this ties into the story of course, but it has a huge effect on the way that the game plays in the long term. Because unlike previous installments, the player has no say in the progression of the characters. So when I put it like that, it kinda sounds like a downgrade, right? And coming off the whole Famicom trilogy, but especially FF3 where you had so much freedom to shape your party however you wanted, this is kind of a shocking shakeup. And yeah, it's true that you lose the freedom, and the sense of long-term planning is completely lost. But let's not forget how far forward this change in the formula pushed the story. The story which, as a reminder, is pretty central to FF4's identity and method of engaging the player. It's not all bad from a gameplay standpoint either, as giving the developers such strict control over the party at any given point essentially forces the player to constantly readapt to the abilities at hand. The party lineup is constantly rotating, so kind of like FF2 except the only party member guaranteed to be active is Cecil. This actually leads to a more dynamic party throughout the game, and since the game knows exactly who's in your party at all points, encounters are more balanced according to your specific setup in each moment. You might remember that I really didn't like the constantly changing party in FF2, but in that game it was mostly because I felt that it conflicted with the game's leveling and growth systems. Every character has a static role here, so that conflict just isn't applicable. I also complained about how rotating party members in FF2 would always join the team being extremely weak. That's occasionally the case here, but it's never an issue because of how quickly they get up to speed, and most of the time they join the party being just as strong as the rest of the group. Although since the party progression is out of my hands now, that opens the door to there being a few parts that I don't really agree with. The most notable of these is that Tella really outstays his welcome in the first part of the game. He knows this super powerful spell called Meteor, but he can't use it or else it'll kill him, and the game's obviously not gonna let you kill off a character while he's still important to the plot, so they handle this by making Meteor visible to you, but it costs 99 MP, and Tella's max MP is 90. This is fine for a little bit, but it gets old fast. 90 MP is such an unnecessarily small amount, and it doesn't take long at all before you start having other mages in your party who are weaker than Tella with more MP. He has a spell called Osmos which absorbs enemy MP, and that helps a little bit, but it's not enough in my opinion. It's honestly a relief when he finally leaves your party, especially as he's practically immediately replaced by Rosa with 300 MP. Clearly the designers were aware that 90 MP isn't nearly enough, so why limit one of the most prominent magic users in the game to that small amount? I really don't buy that there wasn't a better way to solve this. To be fair to the game, situations like this are rare, but whenever they do pop up, I can't help but miss being able to adapt my party to the situation at hand however I wanted. If the game were structured more like FF3, I would have been able to swap out Tella with another character, and the whole issue could have been avoided. Still, the game does a mostly fine job at giving you an appropriately suited team, so it's not as big of an issue as it could have been. Another change that comes with FF4 is the ability to have up to 5 party members at once. Like I said, you won't always have a full party, but it's pretty fun when you do have one. The front and back row system has also been altered a little bit to accommodate for the higher party member count. Instead of assigning each character's position individually, 3 party members will always be in the front with 2 always in the back, and you just assign party members based on where you want them. And you can also reverse it so it's 3 in the back and 2 in the front, but there will always be a 2 to 3 ratio. I'm pretty neutral on this change, honestly. Certain classes naturally gravitate towards certain rows anyway, so it kind of feels like you're just plugging in puzzle pieces rather than making a real strategic decision. It doesn't affect my experience positively or negatively. On top of all this, the way magic is used has changed once again. For starters, the MP system from FF2 is back and here to stay from this point forwards. And honestly, that's just for the better in my opinion. The spell charge system from FF1 and 3 definitely had its merits, but using MP allows spells to completely ignore the tier system, which allows you to keep way more of them. So especially in a game like FF4 where you learn so many spells, MP is the right call. You actually get so much magic in this game that it can kinda be hard to navigate the menu at points, but I do appreciate all the extra options. Magic isn't bought from shops anymore either, probably as a result of the constant party rotation. It would be really obnoxious to have to constantly rebuy the same spells over and over again, and that's not even mentioning that not all characters even have access to magic in the first place, so this is definitely an appreciated change. So how do you learn magic instead? Well, that's simple, you just learn spells the more you level up, or in very specific cases through story progression. And honestly, I like this a lot more than the previous method. It feels like it scales with character strength in a much more intuitive way, and it's just a nice convenience to have one less thing to spend your gil on, especially when there are so many characters that you have to buy equipment for this time. So with all of this mechanical overhaul in mind, FF4 is undoubtedly a simplified game compared to its predecessors when it comes to character building and the actual long-term RPG mechanics. Even despite all that though, I would still call this the most engaging game in the series so far on a moment-to-moment basis. Why? The battles. When you consider the ATB system as well as the maximum of 5 party members and the fact that you're constantly switching around the abilities you have access to, yeah, Final Fantasy IV can be a much more hectic game than any of the first 3. Even in just standard battles, I find myself making active moment-to-moment decisions more often than just resorting to a default strategy, something I never would have said about any of the previous games. Past the very earliest sections of this game, I really don't find myself using the Pixel Remaster's auto-battle feature much at all, and all of this goes double for the boss fights. The boss design in this game is easily more ambitious than any of the previous installments, and some of them actually use ATB really well in my opinion. You see this as early as the tutorial boss against the Mist Dragon, which will counterattack if you don't wait for it to reveal itself, but my favorite example is the Demon Wall. This boss essentially puts you on a timer as it will kill you instantly if it catches up to you, so the whole thing is happening in real time as it inches closer and closer to you. It's pretty tense, and a great use of the new combat system. Not every boss is like this, but even the more standard fights are a lot more engaging thanks to all the improvements I've already talked about. The final boss, Zeromus, actually puts up a pretty good fight. He's a fun challenge in a way that no other boss in the series has been to this point. Another quick detail that I want to point out about the bosses is that a lot of them actually deteriorate the further into the fight that you get. The Octomammoth fight at the start is a good example. The more damage you deal to him, the fewer tentacles he has above water. It's a small detail, but a cool creative way to signify that information to the player. I also want to note that I finally feel like these games are at a point where if you're stuck on a specific encounter, the way to get past it is usually just to play smarter. You have more than enough unique abilities and items at your disposal, so there's always plenty of different ways to approach any given situation. FF3 was really close to this, but so many points in that game had you using the job system like a puzzle solution, so there really wasn't much room to experiment. Even though FF4's RPG mechanics are a lot simpler, there's so much more to do in the heat of the moment, and the game is only better for it. Underneath all the mechanics of FF4, the Final Fantasy formula only continues to get more and more refined. There's still lots of personality and fun moments throughout the towns in the game, and it's pretty much the same as FF3, which I already liked quite a bit. One of the advantages of adhering to a more involved story though is that some of these towns have important story relevance, and the unique events in each can relate to the story. My favorite example of this is Mysidia. It's the town that Cecil and the Red Wings attacked at the start, so naturally they're not too pleased to see Cecil return. And if you talk around to the villagers here, they'll curse you in a few different comical ways. It can be pretty funny. Another aspect that returns from FF3 is the fact that there are multiple overworlds. Unlike that game though, the overworlds here are much more distinct. You have the standard one where you start the game, but eventually you get access to the underworld, and the game's climax sees you going all the way to the moon. This gives the game a feeling of being a much more grand adventure than ever before, and yeah, it really works. It helps that all of these worlds feel visually distinct from each other too. They all have very distinguishable color palettes, and the moon specifically has a lot of sci-fi elements. The moon in particular feels wildly different than everything else, just like it should. The enemies up here feel almost like aliens, and the atmosphere feels uniquely threatening. As for the dungeons in Final Fantasy IV, I'd say they start out pretty close in complexity to those in FF3, but they eventually get much more complicated. They're never as obnoxious as the ones in the first two games though. I mainly just mean that the paths to uncover secrets get more and more complicated, but it's never too much to keep up with. The final dungeon, the Lunar Subterrane, can actually be pretty confusing if you're trying to go after all the high-level equipment, but it's a fun kind of navigational challenge, not the one that's just trying to waste your time. This is also where the dungeons start including save points, so even the long ones are never unrelenting gauntlets. The Crystal Tower in 3 seriously could have benefited from these. Most dungeons don't really feature any sort of gimmick, but on the rare occasion they do, it's usually just more annoying than anything. The Magnetic Cave definitely stuck out to me as the low point. You can't have anything metal equipped, which means you essentially just have to downgrade all of your equipment. And that's all there is to it. It's just an unnecessary difficulty spike because of this, and I never look forward to revisiting this part of the game. Still though, this is the exception and not the rule. It's mostly fine. Another area that's quite similar to the last game is the optional content, which once again mostly consists of extra dungeons which lead to summon fights. It's nothing groundbreaking, but for what it's worth, once again I find these pretty enjoyable, and I think it's smart to have a new summon as a reward because of how visually distinct they all are. All the side content here feels worthwhile and fun, that's the most important thing. Okay, I feel like I've covered this game pretty thoroughly at this point, so I want to return to something I briefly mentioned early in the video, and that's the fact that this is the Final Fantasy game I've played through to the end the most times by far. Why is that? I do love this game, but without getting too far ahead of myself, it's definitely not my favorite in the series or anything like that. So what is it about FF4 that keeps me coming back? Well, that's an easy answer for me. It's the easiest game in the series to just jump into at any given point and go without thinking too much in the long term. Your party's always changing, so it's always easy to readapt to the game's rules after any period of time, and choices you make early on don't really have any effect on your experience all those hours down the line. It's an actively engaging game, but even with its original intended difficulty, it's not a particularly challenging one. It's pretty short, all things considered. The Pixel Remaster only ran me around 15 hours. What I'm trying to say is that Final Fantasy IV is a low-stakes and low-commitment adventure. If anything, it's actually closer to an action game than the traditional RPG experience that you might expect from the series at this point, and the ATB combat only furthers that comparison. That'll definitely knock off a few points for some people, and I get that, but for me, I don't know, I find it kind of relaxing to be honest. It's just such a classic game in every sense of the word, and it's so easy and comfortable to slip back into every single time. It helps that I know the game super well by now too. It may not be my favorite of the series, but that relentlessly replayable nature was exactly why I played it so many times throughout high school. And I'll always cherish those memories of the game. Because of that, I'll always have a soft spot for it. I definitely love this game a bit more than it really deserves. Don't get me wrong though, that's not me saying that this game doesn't deserve any praise. In all honesty, the only reason I hesitate to call FF4 a really great game is because I've played countless RPGs that came out way later than this one did, and I've seen games that handle the same types of design motives a lot better in my opinion. That's just to be expected with a game this old. When you look at this game as a further evolution of the series though, it's honestly a really astonishing step forward. It's really bold with all of its changes, but it pulls them off so well and with so much confidence, it's impossible to not admire. It's hard to call this a total improvement off of its predecessor from a gameplay standpoint, as the two different approaches yield two pretty different results, but I will say this, I enjoy playing Final Fantasy IV more than I enjoy playing Final Fantasy III, although rationally I feel like it's more realistic to say that the two games are equal on that front. For everything 3 did better, 4 has its own unique strengths to help settle the difference. But even past all that, the most important thing about FF4 to me is the vast overhaul to the storytelling ambitions. This game marks a very firm shift in the series towards character-driven stories that aim to tell tales that invest the player just by the merits of them being legitimately interesting. This is why I genuinely feel that the scene in Cecil's room right at the start of the game is the single most important moment in the entire Final Fantasy franchise. Yes, really. This focus on characters and emotion above all else is arguably the defining trait of the entire overarching series, and this scene is where all of that was thrust into the spotlight. So is Final Fantasy IV this perfect game? Hell no, but it's one that I still have so much respect and love for. It's such an ambitious title on so many different levels, and I really do feel that as a product of its time, its methods of telling a story through game mechanics were incredibly innovative and influential. This is yet another case where historical context is so important to what makes Final Fantasy IV so good. A lot of people will say FF4 is the best game to start with in the series if you like classic RPGs, and for a while I was definitely one of those people. After making this video though, I don't know if I can say that anymore, because completely skipping the first 3 games significantly lessens the impact of so many of this game's most crucial decisions. That being said though, that's gonna happen at pretty much any entry point that's not the original, so I do still see the appeal in starting here, especially if you're not immediately interested in having a well-rounded view of the entire series. I can't expect everyone to care as much about the evolution of the series as I do. Still though, to those who are already fans of the series, I'd love to recommend replaying this game right after having experienced the original trilogy. It just might change your perspective and make you appreciate this game's accomplishments even more. At the end of the day, Final Fantasy IV is undoubtedly one of the most important games in the series, and as a result, it's a game that means a lot to me.